I found bank statements showing my mother embezzled $220,000 from my inheritance. But at my father's funeral, she cried, saying I was ungrateful and cruel. The folder of financial documents fell from my trembling hands and shattered on the cold floor of my deceased father's office, scattering dozens of bank statements that revealed a truth so devastating that my brain initially refused to process the impossible meaning of those numbers, meticulously organized in columns showing systematic monthly transfers totaling $220,000 secretly diverted from the joint account that my father had specifically established for my inheritance during the 3 years prior to his sudden death, caused by cardiac complications that no one had adequately foreseen. The oppressive silence of that preserved office, exactly as Dad had left it 6 months ago, when he unexpectedly departed, transformed each of my breaths into an amplified sound, echoing among shelves filled with business administration books and framed photographs showing our apparently happy family in moments that now seemed like carefully staged lies to hide sordid financial secrets that my mother Vera had kept hidden during years of family coexistence, that I naively believed was founded on genuine love and absolute transparency between people who shared unbreakable blood ties. My 39 years of existence carefully constructed on foundations of family trust, and especially on the comforting certainty that my parents were fundamentally honest and ethical people, completely crumbled when I knelt on the worn Persian rug to collect those compromising bank statements that revealed a systematic pattern of transfers always made on the 15th day of each month during exactly 36 consecutive months before Dad's death. Each bank statement I held with uncontrollably trembling fingers showed amounts varying between $5,000 and $8,000 being transferred from the inheritance account specifically designated for me through a formal will registered at the notary's office to a personal checking account in Vera's exclusive name that she secretly maintained at a different bank from the one where our family traditionally centralized all financial operations related to Dad's business, and the savings accumulated during 4 decades of hard work building the family business of industrial equipment distribution that prospered consistently, transforming our family from modest middle class to comfortably established financially. The discovery of those incriminating documents had not been planned or remotely anticipated when I entered that silent office on a cold Saturday morning, simply looking for the updated deed to the beach house that Dad had promised to officially transfer to my name as a birthday gift a few months before his sudden death, permanently interrupted all future plans we had discussed animatedly during weekly family dinners where he seemed healthy and vigorous despite his 68 years, demonstrating impressive energy when talking enthusiastically about business expansion projects and especially about ensuring that both Patricia and I were financially protected through substantial inheritances that would allow us to live comfortably regardless of unpredictable future circumstances. Dad had always been a meticulously organized man who kept all important documents systematically filed in colored folders, identified with handwritten labels using that elegant and distinctive handwriting he had developed during decades managing complex businesses that required obsessive attention to financial details, and especially to precise documentation of each commercial transaction conducted through the family business he had built literally from scratch, transforming a modest bank loan into a prosperous enterprise employing more than 50 dedicated employees. When I finally located the light blue folder identified with a carefully written label where Dad had noted Carolina's inheritance, official documents, my heart was beating at an accelerated rhythm of innocent expectation about finally resolving pending bureaucratic issues related to the beach house deed without any premonition of the financial horrors that folder contained, meticulously documented through bank statements that Dad had apparently systematically saved as evidence of unauthorized transfers he probably discovered shortly before dying, but didn't have enough time to confront Vera or take corrective legal measures that would protect my inheritance against continued fraudulent diversions. The blue folder contained not only the compromising bank statements showing systematic transfers made by Vera during 3 consecutive years, but also a handwritten letter with Dad's unmistakable handwriting dated just 2 weeks before his sudden death, a devastating personal document where he expressed profound anguish about having recently discovered the misappropriations that Vera had been secretly committing against my inheritance, and especially about not knowing how to proceed in the face of that marital betrayal that threatened to destroy our family through inevitable legal conflicts if he decided to publicly confront the financial crimes his wife of 42 years of marriage had deliberately perpetrated against their own daughter. The handwritten letter my father left was a document so emotionally charged and psychologically disturbing that I needed to read it 3 consecutive times before I could minimally process the devastating implications of what he had discovered, and especially the impossible moral dilemma in which he found himself during the last weeks of his life, upon realizing that his wife was systematically stealing financial resources specifically intended to guarantee my comfortable future. My dear Carolina, the letter began with that affectionate formality characteristic of Dad's communicative style. If you are reading these words, it means I departed before managing to personally resolve an extremely delicate and painful situation I recently discovered that keeps me awake during the early morning hours, desperately trying to find a solution that protects you without completely destroying our family through devastating public scandals. The following words revealed how Dad had accidentally discovered the financial diversions while reviewing bank statements during preparation of annual income tax documentation. Noticing substantial discrepancies between the amounts he had deposited monthly into the inheritance account designated for me and the current balances that were significantly lower than they should be, mathematically considering the regular deposits made during 3 years without any withdrawals authorized by me or by himself. I discreetly confronted your mother about these financial discrepancies, hoping there would be a reasonable explanation related to unexpected bank fees or accounting errors that could be easily corrected through communication with the bank, the letter continued, revealing Dad's tragic naivety about the depth of betrayal Vera had systematically perpetrated. But when I presented the bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, she initially tried to deny any knowledge about these transactions, then claimed they were temporary loans necessary to cover emergency expenses related to residential renovations she didn't want to worry me about during a stressful period of business expansion. And finally, when confronted with irrefutable evidence of systematic transfers made consistently during 36 consecutive months, she coldly admitted she had taken that money because she believed you didn't need such a substantial inheritance, considering you already had a stable career as an architect, and that she herself deserved additional financial compensation for the sacrifices she had made during decades as a dedicated wife enduring long hours. I spent working to build the family business, instead of dedicating more time to her emotional needs. The grotesque justification Vera presented to Dad to rationalize her financial crimes against my inheritance revealed a disturbing depth of accumulated resentment and especially psychological distortion that allowed her to simultaneously steal systematically from her own daughter while maintaining a public facade of a loving and devoted mother during weekly family dinners, where she smiled warmly and asked interested questions about my architectural projects and personal life as if she genuinely cared about my well-being instead of secretly sabotaging my financial future through methodically executed misappropriations during years of planned criminal activity. Carolina, my beloved daughter, I write this letter because I need you to know the truth about what your mother did in case something happens to me before I can resolve this situation legally, and especially recover the $220,000 she diverted from your inheritance during the last 3 years, Dad had written with handwriting that became progressively more irregular as the letter advanced, revealing growing emotional agitation while he documented that devastating marital betrayal. I saved all the bank statements as evidence of the fraudulent transfers and intend to consult a lawyer specializing in family law next week to understand what legal options exist to recover your financial resources without necessarily publicly destroying our family through a criminal lawsuit against your own mother that would inevitably cause substantial social scandal and especially emotional suffering for you and your sister Patricia, who don't deserve to be dragged through such sordid and publicly humiliating family conflicts. The letter ended with words that now assumed a devastating prophetic quality, considering Dad died just 11 days after writing that anguished document without having gotten enough time to consult a lawyer or take any legal measures that would protect my inheritance against continuation of the fraudulent diversions perpetrated by Vera. I promise I will correct this situation and ensure you receive in full the inheritance I worked during decades to accumulate specifically intended to provide financial security that allows you to pursue your professional dreams without material worries that could limit your life choices. He had written with tragic optimism about a future he would never have the opportunity to realize. If for some terrible reason I cannot resolve this personally before departing, I trust you will use this documentary evidence to seek appropriate legal justice, and especially to protect Patricia against possible similar financial manipulations that your mother could perpetrate against her too, considering the pattern of criminal behavior she demonstrated by systematically stealing from you during 3 consecutive years, without showing any genuine remorse when confronted about her deliberate actions. Dad's signature at the end of the letter was accompanied by a date that made me shudder involuntarily when I noticed its temporal proximity to the day of his sudden death. He had written that document just 11 days before his heart permanently stopped during peaceful sleep on a cold early morning that completely transformed our lives through a loss I was still processing emotionally 6 months later. even as I now discovered that my grief over Dad's death needed to be reprocessed, including growing anger about him having departed before managing to protect my inheritance against Vera's continued financial crimes. Sitting in that silent office, holding simultaneously Dad's handwritten letter and the bank statements that meticulously documented Vera's financial crimes during 36 consecutive months, I felt as if I were experiencing multiple layers of simultaneous grief. Renewed grief over Dad's premature death that deprived me not only of his loving physical presence, but also of his active protection against maternal financial predations. Grief over the loss of the image I maintained about Vera as a fundamentally decent mother, who occasionally made errors in judgment but essentially loved me genuinely. And especially grief over the naivety that had allowed me to continue blindly trusting Vera during the 6 months since Dad's death, without remotely suspecting she had been systematically stealing from me during years while maintaining an elaborate facade of a concerned mother consoling a bereaved daughter through a shared grief process that now revealed itself to be completely fraudulent, considering she was secretly relieved by Dad's death because it eliminated the only witness and potential obstacle to her continued misappropriations. The magnitude of maternal betrayal those documents revealed was so psychologically devastating that my brain oscillated repeatedly between shocked acceptance of the undeniable reality demonstrated through irrefutable bank evidence and desperate denial that insisted there must be a reasonable alternative explanation that would preserve some vestige of the maternal relationship I believed I had possessed during 39 years of shared existence. The memory that involuntarily emerged from my traumatized consciousness while holding those incriminating documents was of Dad's funeral 6 months earlier. An elaborate ceremony held in a chapel packed with hundreds of people genuinely mourning the loss of a man respected for his business integrity, and especially for his personal kindness consistently demonstrated through decades of professional and personal relationships characterized by absolute honesty and genuine generosity. During that devastating funeral where I had cried uncontrollably over the irreparable loss of the father who had always been my emotional safe harbor and my inspiring example of how to live an ethical and meaningful life, Vera had approached me at the end of the ceremony when most of those present had already departed, leaving only close family and intimate friends gathered in small groups collectively processing the loss through silent embraces and shared tears. I was sitting alone on a chapel bench trying to gather sufficient emotional strength to face the post-funeral reception planned at the family home when Vera appeared at my side with a facial expression that combined apparent sadness with something more disturbing that I couldn't clearly identify at the time, but now recognized retrospectively as poorly disguised resentment mixed with defensive guilt, characteristic of people who know they have committed serious transgressions against those they pretend to love publicly. "Carolina, I need to talk to you about something important before everyone arrives at the house for the reception." Vera had begun with a carefully controlled voice that contrasted strangely with the emotionally charged occasion of the funeral we had just experienced. I had initially assumed she wanted to discuss practical arrangements related to probate or bureaucratic issues about the family business that would need to be resolved during the following months, but her next words revealed a completely different and much more sinister agenda, considering what I now knew about her hidden financial crimes. "I know you and your father always had an especially close relationship throughout your life, and that you're probably feeling emotionally orphaned now that he's departed, leaving an impossible void to fill. But I need to warn you against cultivating unjust resentments against me based on distorted perceptions about our marriage that you may have developed hearing only his perspective about our marital dynamics during 42 years of shared life." She had spoken with a tone that combined veiled warning with preemptive victimization, as if anticipating possible future accusations against her that Dad might have mentioned before dying. Vera's words at the funeral now assumed completely sinister meaning in light of Dad's letter, revealing he had confronted her about the financial diversions just weeks before his death. Clearly, she was trying to establish an anticipatory defensive narrative that would paint me as an ungrateful and cruel daughter, should I discover the misappropriations and decide to confront her publicly, or seek legal justice against the crimes she had systematically perpetrated. "Your sister Patricia has always better understood the complexities of the sacrifices I made during decades as a dedicated wife, enduring your father's long absences while he built the business, instead of prioritizing the family's emotional needs. And I hope you can also eventually develop sufficient maturity to recognize that long marriages involve difficult compromises, and especially that wives deserve appropriate financial recognition for years invested enduring inevitable emotional neglect when men prioritize professional ambitions above family relationships." Vera had continued with grotesque argumentation that essentially rationalized her thefts against my inheritance as deserved compensation for supposed marital suffering during a marriage that had always seemed outwardly stable and mutually respectful. So I strongly suggest you avoid making hasty judgments or spreading distorted narratives about me that could cause unnecessary family divisions during a period when we should be uniting through shared grief instead of fragmenting through unfounded accusations based on partial perspectives that don't completely capture complex realities of long-term marital relationships. The absolute cynicism of Vera making that manipulative preventive speech during Dad's funeral, while she knew perfectly well she had systematically stolen $220,000 from my inheritance during 3 consecutive years, revealed a depth of sociopathy that left me simultaneously horrified and nauseated when retrospectively processing that conversation in light of the documentary evidence I now held tremblingly. My confused response at the funeral had been simply to mechanically embrace Vera, while murmuring something vague about not completely understanding what she was talking about, but that I obviously had no intention of judging a 42-year marital relationship between her and Dad, considering I had observed outwardly only a limited fraction of the private dynamics that shaped their shared life during decades before my birth, and especially during periods when I was focused on building my own professional career and independent life away from the immediate family nucleus. At the time, I had interpreted that strange speech from Vera as a product of extreme emotional stress, combined with grief processed in particular ways that sometimes produce unusual verbal behaviors at funerals when people are operating under substantial psychological tension. But now I clearly perceived that manipulative conversation had been carefully planned, as a preemptive defense against possible future discoveries about her financial crimes. She feared Dad might have mentioned to me before dying unexpectedly, before taking corrective legal measures that would protect my inheritance against her continued predations. The memory of that funeral conversation now transformed from a confusing but apparently well-intentioned moment into additional evidence of the systematic psychological manipulation Vera had perpetrated, not only against my finances but also against my emotional perception of her as a fundamentally honest mother who deserved absolute trust and especially unconditional loyalty, regardless of any family conflicts that might arise related to inheritance issues or resource distribution after Dad's death. The anger that began to progressively boil inside my chest, oppressed by the discovery of those incriminating documents, was not simply about stolen money. Although $220,000 was a substantial amount, representing years of Dad's hard work specifically dedicated to guaranteeing my comfortable financial future. But mainly about the fundamental betrayal of maternal trust Vera had systematically perpetrated during years while maintaining an elaborate facade of a loving mother concerned about my well-being when in reality she was actively sabotaging my future financial security through methodically executed misappropriations. She apparently rationalized through distorted narratives about deserving compensation for supposed marital sacrifices not adequately recognized during her marriage with Dad. The magnitude of hypocrisy revealed through that bank documentation was so psychologically devastating that it completely transformed my understanding not only about who Vera really was as a person, but also about the fundamental nature of our maternal relationship during 39 years that I had naively interpreted as based on genuine love, when apparently it was founded at least partially on calculated manipulation, and especially on her willingness to financially harm me whenever she perceived a lucrative opportunity she could exploit without immediate legal consequences. I remained sitting in that silent office for an indeterminate time, holding the bank statements and Dad's handwritten letter, while trying to mentally process the devastating implications of what I had discovered, and especially decide what course of action to take in the face of that impossible family situation that instantly transformed Vera from a bereaved mother processing marital loss into a financial criminal who had systematically stolen from me during years while my father was still alive, and especially during the 6 months since his death when she probably continued diverting additional resources from the inheritance trusting. I would remain naively ignorant about her misappropriations until it was too late to recover substantial amounts she had already spent or transferred to offshore accounts inaccessible through conventional legal processes. The first obvious decision was to directly confront Vera about the financial crimes documented through those bank statements. But this alternative brought substantial risks, considering she had already demonstrated during the funeral a willingness to construct manipulative defensive narratives that painted me as a cruel and ungrateful daughter, making unfounded accusations against a devoted mother who supposedly sacrificed decades of her life, enduring marital neglect for the family's benefit, who now betrayed her through unjustified disloyalty. The alternative of simply ignoring those compromising bank statements, and pretending I had never discovered the systematic misappropriations perpetrated by Vera during 36 consecutive months briefly passed through my traumatized consciousness as a tempting possibility that would allow preserving some appearance of family normalcy instead of detonating devastating legal conflicts that would inevitably permanently destroy any remaining vestiges of maternal relationship I still maintained with her, despite irrefutable evidence about her deliberate financial crimes against my inheritance carefully accumulated by Dad. But this option of convenient denial lasted only a few seconds before being completely discarded by the inescapable reality that Vera had not simply committed an isolated error in judgment or momentarily succumbed to opportunistic financial temptation, but rather had methodically executed during 3 entire years a systematic scheme of monthly diversions totaling $220,000, deliberately stolen from the inheritance account, designated specifically to guarantee my comfortable future regardless of unpredictable circumstances that might affect my professional career as an architect. The magnitude of maternal betrayal revealed through that bank documentation meticulously preserved by Dad transcended merely financial questions about illegally diverted money and entered much more disturbing territory of conscious psychological manipulation, where Vera had maintained during years an elaborate facade of a loving mother concerned about my well-being while simultaneously actively sabotaging my future financial security through misappropriations. She apparently rationalized through distorted narratives about deserving additional compensation for supposed marital sacrifices not adequately recognized. The most psychologically devastating aspect of that discovery in Dad's silent office was not just confirming Vera had systematically stolen a substantial amount specifically intended to protect my financial future, but mainly retrospectively perceiving how she had skillfully manipulated our family interactions during those 3 years of active criminal activity, maintaining impeccable public behavior as a devoted mother, while secretly executing fraudulent bank transfers on the 15th day of each month, with metronomic regularity that revealed careful planning instead of uncontrollable momentary impulses. Each weekly family dinner we had shared during that period of 36 months when Vera was actively stealing from me now, retrospectively transformed into an elaborate theatrical performance where she smiled warmly while asking about my architectural projects and personal life as if genuinely caring about my professional successes, when in reality she was secretly undermining the financial foundations that should sustain those same successes through misappropriations executed with calculated coldness, characteristic of professional criminals, instead of mothers biologically programmed to protect their own daughters' interests. Dad's handwritten letter accompanying the incriminating bank statements revealed an additional dimension of tragedy in that impossible situation. By documenting in detail his profound anguish about having discovered the misappropriations just weeks before his sudden death, without having gotten enough time to implement corrective legal measures that would protect my inheritance against continuation of the fraudulent diversions systematically perpetrated by his wife of 42 years, whom he presumably trusted implicitly during decades of apparently stable and mutually respectful marriage, based on shared values of honesty and family integrity. Dad's tragic naivety in discreetly confronting Vera about the financial discrepancies, hoping to find a reasonable explanation related to easily correctable accounting errors, revealed how even fundamentally good and ethical people can profoundly underestimate the capacity for psychological manipulation certain individuals possess to rationalize criminal behaviors through construction of distorted narratives that transform victims into villains and perpetrators into martyrs, unjustly persecuted by ungrateful family members who don't adequately recognize supposedly heroic sacrifices made during decades of shared coexistence. The grotesque justifications Vera presented to Dad to rationalize her systematic thefts against my inheritance included absurd claims that I didn't need such substantial financial resources considering my stable career as an architect, and especially offensive affirmations that she herself deserved. Additional compensation for unrecognized marital sacrifices during a marriage, where Dad supposedly prioritized business ambitions above her emotional needs, as if decades of hard work building a prosperous family business that benefited the entire family constituted marital neglect deserving financial punishment through systematic thefts against an innocent daughter, completely oblivious to accumulated marital resentments. The revelation in Dad's letter about how Vera initially tried to deny knowledge of unauthorized transfers before tactically shifting to claims of temporary loans necessary to cover emergency expenses, and finally coldly admitting she had taken that money because she believed she deserved additional financial compensation, demonstrated a classic pattern of criminal behavior, where perpetrators progressively test different defensive narratives until they identify which justification resonates most effectively with specific audiences to minimize potential legal consequences of deliberately committed transgressions. Dad's promise at the end of the letter about correcting that situation and ensuring I received in full the inheritance worked for during decades now assumed a devastating prophetic quality, considering he died just 11 days after writing that anguished document without having gotten enough time to consult a specialized lawyer or implement any protective measures that would prevent Vera from continuing to divert additional resources during the 6 months following his death, when she probably intensified the misappropriations, trusting I would remain naively ignorant about the financial crimes until it was too late to recover substantial amounts already spent or transferred to secret inaccessible accounts. The decision about how to proceed in the face of that devastating discovery involved emotional and practical complexities that transcended simple calculations about costs versus benefits of different available courses of action, because any choice I made would inevitably permanently transform the fundamental nature of my relationship with Vera from a private maternal dynamic, based on supposedly unbreakable blood ties, into a public legal confrontation characterized by formal criminal accusations and detailed judicial scrutiny about intimate aspects of our family history. I preferred to keep confidential away from sensationalist public attention. Directly confronting Vera about the financial crimes documented through the bank statements constituted an apparently obvious alternative that would allow resolving the issue through private negotiations instead of public judicial processes. But this option brought substantial risks, considering she had already demonstrated during Dad's funeral a calculated willingness to construct manipulative defensive narratives that preemptively painted me as a cruel and ungrateful daughter, making unfounded accusations against a devoted mother who supposedly sacrificed decades enduring marital neglect for the family's benefit, who now betrayed her through unjustified disloyalty during a vulnerable period of shared grief. The disturbing memory of the strange conversation Vera initiated with me at the end of Dad's funeral now revealed itself completely as a carefully planned preemptive defense against possible future discoveries about misappropriations she feared Dad might have mentioned before dying unexpectedly. Eliminating the only witness capable of corroborating the complete extent of systematic diversions perpetrated during 36 consecutive months while he was still alive, and especially during the period immediately after death, when Vera probably continued stealing, trusting that absence of paternal supervision would facilitate continuation of criminal activities without immediate detection. Vera's manipulative speech during the funeral preemptively warning me against cultivating unjust resentments based on distorted perceptions about her marriage with Dad, and especially suggesting Patricia better understood the complexities of marital sacrifices while I needed to develop sufficient maturity to recognize wives deserved appropriate financial recognition for years, invested enduring emotional neglect, revealed impressive psychological sophistication in constructing defensive narratives that simultaneously victimize themselves while preemptively attacking the credibility of potential future accusers through veiled suggestions about emotional immaturity or distorted perspectives about complex marital dynamics. The alternative of seeking legal justice through formal criminal complaint to police authorities constituted a more definitive course of action that would officially establish my status as a victim of family fraud instead of voluntary participant in questionable financial schemes. But this choice would inevitably result in unwanted publicity about intimate family conflicts and especially transform Vera from a bereaved mother, processing marital loss, into a wanted criminal, potentially facing years in prison depending on the severity of sentences imposed for multiple crimes including qualified misappropriation, improper use of fiduciary resources, and potentially falsification of bank documents if investigations revealed she had forged fraudulent authorizations to execute unauthorized transfers. The possibility of simply hiring a lawyer specializing in inheritance law to resolve the issue through civil action, seeking restitution of diverted amounts without necessarily involving criminal authorities, offered an apparently reasonable middle ground that would allow recovering stolen financial resources while avoiding transforming family conflict into a public criminal case. But this alternative brought substantial risk of Vera counterattacking through fabricated accusations about my supposed conscious participation in the transfers, or distorted allegations about having received verbal authorization from Dad to temporarily use inheritance account resources to cover family emergency expenses I supposedly tacitly approved during casual conversations never adequately documented. The moral dilemma about how far I had an obligation to protect Vera against deserved legal consequences for crimes she deliberately committed during years of systematic fraudulent activity versus responsibility to protect my own financial interests and professional reputation against Potential future accusations she could fabricate if she decided to implement a defensive strategy based on transforming herself from perpetrator into victim through distorted narratives about having been coerced or manipulated by unknown third parties was particularly torturous, considering she remained biologically my mother, regardless of the criminal transgressions she had consciously committed. The question about underlying motivations that had led Vera to elaborate and execute such a systematic scheme of misappropriations during 36 consecutive months remained fundamentally unanswered, even after reading Dad's detailed letter, documenting his confrontation with her about financial diversions, because the grotesque justifications she presented about deserving compensation for unrecognized marital sacrifices seemed insufficient to completely explain the emotional coldness necessary to systematically steal from one's own daughter during years while maintaining an elaborate facade of a loving mother during weekly family interactions that now revealed themselves to be carefully rehearsed theatrical performances. The possibility that Vera was experiencing some type of cognitive deterioration related to aging that compromised ethical judgment or ability to fully understand moral implications of her actions offered a partially comforting explanation that preserved some vestige of the image I maintained about her as a fundamentally decent person corrupted by pathological circumstances instead of a consciously malicious criminal. But Dad's letter describing detailed confrontation where she presented sophisticated and tactically adaptable justifications strongly suggested Vera maintained full cognitive capacities and especially clear awareness about the illegal and morally reprehensible nature of systematically executed misappropriations. The memory of all weekly family dinners shared during those 36 months when Vera was actively stealing from me now transformed into a source of retrospective nausea, imagining how she managed to maintain impeccable composure as a concerned mother, asking affectionately about my architectural projects and personal life, while secretly planning the next fraudulent transfer scheduled for the 15th day of the following month with metronomic regularity that revealed impressive discipline instead of uncontrollable momentary impulses, characteristic of crimes of passion committed under extreme emotional stress that could potentially mitigate legal culpability. The anger that progressively boiled in my chest oppressed by the discovery of those incriminating documents was not simply about stolen monetary amounts, although $220,000 constituted a substantial sum representing years of Dad's hard work, but mainly about the fundamental betrayal of maternal trust Vera had systematically perpetrated, while exploiting my naivety about presumed family integrity to execute elaborate financial crimes. She apparently rationalized through distorted narratives, transforming an innocent victim into a privileged beneficiary, undeserving of such substantial inheritance, considering a stable professional career that made additional financial resources supposedly unnecessary, according to her unilateral judgment. The hypothesis that Vera might be being manipulated or coerced by unknown third parties who had identified emotional vulnerabilities related to accumulated marital resentments during decades of marriage and exploited those psychological weaknesses to convince her to participate in a fraudulent scheme through promises of deserved financial compensation or veiled threats about negative consequences. If she didn't cooperate, offered a marginally less disturbing alternative that preserved remote possibility of eventual family reconciliation if investigations revealed she had been a victim instead of voluntary perpetrator. But even in this most favorable scenario, the fact remained that Vera actively participated during 3 years in deliberate criminal activities against my inheritance. The decision to immediately call my sister Patricia and inform her about the discovery of incriminating bank statements, and especially about Dad's devastating letter documenting confrontation with Vera about misappropriations constituted a necessary step that would allow assessing whether Patricia had also been a victim of similar financial diversions, considering Dad's explicit warning at the end of the letter, alerting me to protect my sister against possible future financial manipulations Vera could perpetrate against her following the pattern of criminal behavior demonstrated by systematically stealing from me during 36 consecutive months without showing genuine remorse when directly confronted about deliberate transgressions. The phone call to Patricia would be particularly difficult, considering she had always maintained an apparently closer relationship with Vera during recent years, and especially considering the manipulative comment Vera made during Dad's funeral, suggesting Patricia better understood the complexities of maternal marital sacrifices, while I supposedly needed to develop additional emotional maturity to adequately appreciate long-term marital dynamics characterized by difficult compromises and inevitable emotional neglect when spouses prioritize professional ambitions above family relationships, according to her distorted perspective about marriage with Dad. The disturbing possibility that Patricia might already be aware of misappropriations committed by Vera and had consciously chosen not to alert me about financial crimes perpetrated against my inheritance constituted an alternative devastating scenario that would transform the discovery of maternal betrayal into revelation of broader family conspiracy involving silent complicity or even active participation. By a sister I presumed maintained fundamental loyalty based on shared blood ties, regardless of any preferential alliances she maintained with Vera during daily family conflicts about relatively trivial issues that characterize normal dynamics between mothers and adult daughters. The urgent need to consult a specialized lawyer immediately before confronting Vera about bank statements or taking any precipitous action that could compromise potential future legal processes was absolutely critical considering the sophistication demonstrated by Vera in constructing preemptive defensive narratives during Dad's funeral, and especially considering the possibility she was already preparing legal counterattacks, anticipating eventual discovery of misappropriations meticulously documented by Dad during the last weeks before his sudden death, that conveniently eliminated the only witness capable of corroborating the complete extent of systematic diversions perpetrated during years of methodically planned criminal activity. The perspective of potentially facing fabricated criminal accusations by Vera if she decided to implement a defensive strategy based on alleging bank transfers had been explicitly authorized by me through private conversations never adequately documented or that I consciously participated in a supposed tax evasion scheme designed to minimize inheritance taxes through artificial distribution of resources through multiple bank accounts controlled by different family members, made it absolutely imperative to immediately establish through official documentation that I discovered the misappropriations only recently through accidental finding while looking for property deed in Dad's preserved office. The emotional complexity of simultaneously processing renewed grief over Dad's premature death that deprived me of his active protection against maternal financial predations, while also processing grief over the loss of the idealized image I maintained about Vera as a fundamentally decent mother was psychologically devastating, in ways that transcended mere sadness about broken relationships, because it involved fundamental reevaluation of my entire family history during 39 years, questioning the authenticity of each maternal interaction I naively interpreted as based on genuine love, when apparently it was partially founded on calculated manipulation and her willingness to financially harm me whenever she perceived exploitable lucrative opportunities without immediate legal consequences. The need to act quickly before Vera discovered I had found the incriminating bank statements, and Dad's letter documenting confrontation about misappropriations, was critical, considering she would probably immediately implement defensive strategies, including destruction of additional evidence that might exist about the complete extent of financial diversions, and especially initiate construction of fabricated narratives about having received verbal authorizations from Dad or from me to temporarily use inheritance account resources to cover family emergency expenses that would later be restituted through reverse transfers that would never materialize due to supposedly unforeseen circumstances beyond her control, according to a distorted version of events she would present defensively. The phone call to Patricia was made with trembling hands that almost dropped my cell phone twice before I finally managed to dial the complete number and wait anxiously while the rings echoed interminably, suggesting perhaps she wouldn't answer, leaving me in torturous suspension about when I could finally share the devastating discovery that had completely transformed my understanding about the fundamental nature of our family, and especially about the person Vera really was behind the carefully maintained mask of devoted mother during decades of coexistence that now revealed itself to be an elaborate theatrical performance designed to hide systematic financial crimes consciously perpetrated against an innocent daughter trusting naively in presumed maternal integrity. When Patricia finally answered after the fifth prolonged ring, her voice had that carefree quality characteristic of a peaceful Saturday afternoon, without any premonition of the revelations that were about to completely demolish her understanding about family dynamics during recent years, and especially about secret criminal activities Vera had methodically executed while maintaining impeccable public appearances as a bereaved widow, processing marital loss through shared grief with daughters she supposedly loved unconditionally, but in reality saw as exploitable financial resources through misappropriations, rationalized through distorted narratives about deserving compensation for marital sacrifices, not adequately recognized during a 42-year marriage. During the following 43 minutes of that emotionally exhausting phone call, I related in detail everything I had discovered in Dad's preserved office, including bank statements documenting systematic transfers totaling $220,000 diverted during 36 consecutive months, and especially the devastating handwritten letter where Dad expressed profound anguish about having confronted Vera just weeks before his death, without having gotten enough time to implement corrective legal measures that would protect my inheritance against continuation of fraudulent diversions deliberately perpetrated by a wife he presumably trusted during decades of apparently stable marriage, based on shared values of family honesty. Patricia's initial reaction was absolute silence. So prolonged, I began to question whether the phone connection had been accidentally interrupted, but finally she broke that oppressive silence with words revealing genuine shock, mixed with paralyzing disbelief about the devastating implications of what I had just reported, instantly transforming Vera from a bereaved mother deserving compassion into a financial criminal who had systematically stolen from her own daughter during years of methodically planned fraudulent activity, executed with calculated coldness incompatible with genuine maternal love. We both presumed she felt unconditionally regardless of any marital resentments accumulated during marriage with Dad. Carolina, are you absolutely certain about the interpretation of these bank statements? Because there's a remote possibility Dad authorized the transfers for some legitimate purpose. He simply didn't adequately communicate before dying unexpectedly, Patricia questioned hesitantly, revealing understandable reluctance to immediately accept such serious accusations against our own mother without personally examining the documentary evidence I had described during a phone call, characterized by intense emotions that could potentially distort objective judgments about appropriate interpretations of complex financial transactions conducted within a family context, where multiple alternative explanations could exist beyond deliberately perpetrated criminal misappropriations. Patricia's reasonable question about possible alternative explanations for bank transfers, documented in the statements I found, forced me to briefly reevaluate whether I was correctly interpreting available evidence or if I had allowed traumatic emotions about the sudden discovery to cloud objective judgment. But mental rereading of Dad's handwritten letter, specifically documenting direct confrontation with Vera about financial diversions and especially describing the tactical progression of her defensive justifications from initial denial to cold admission about having taken money because she believed she deserved additional compensation, completely eliminated any remaining doubts about the criminal nature of systematically executed misappropriations during 36 consecutive months. Patty, Dad's handwritten letter completely eliminates any ambiguity about the nature of the transfers, because he specifically documents having confronted Mom about financial discrepancies, and especially describes in detail how she initially denied knowledge, then claimed temporary loans, and finally coldly admitted taking money because she believed I didn't need such substantial inheritance, and that she deserved compensation for unrecognized marital sacrifices. I explained firmly, trying to convey absolute certainty based on irrefutable documentary evidence, instead of emotionally distorted interpretations that could be legitimately questioned by skeptical observers about such serious accusations against a close family member. The silence that followed my detailed explanation about Dad's letter lasted approximately 15 seconds before Patricia responded, with a progressively more agitated voice revealing accelerated emotional processing of the devastating implications about a discovery that completely transformed the perceived nature of our family nucleus during recent years, and especially about the extent of psychological manipulation Vera had systematically perpetrated to maintain elaborate facades while executing deliberate financial crimes against a daughter trusting naively in presumed maternal integrity as an unquestionable foundation of family relationships, characterized by blood ties supposedly stronger than opportunistic financial temptations. Carol, I need to personally see these bank statements and especially Dad's letter before taking any definitive position about how to proceed. Because frankly, I can't completely process the magnitude of what you're telling me about our own mother having systematically stolen during 3 entire years while maintaining appearances as a bereaved widow consoling daughters through shared grief. Patricia carefully articulated, revealing understandable need to directly examine physical evidence instead of relying exclusively on verbal descriptions even from a trusted sister, because such extraordinary accusations about maternal criminal behavior during years of apparently normal coexistence required meticulous personal verification before implementing any irreversible legal actions. Patricia's suggestion about personally examining the incriminating documentation before deciding appropriate courses of action was perfectly reasonable considering the seriousness of accusations and especially the irreversibility of potential legal processes that would inevitably transform private family conflict into public criminal case, subject to detailed judicial scrutiny and possibly sensationalist media attention about family fraud involving substantial amounts, misappropriated through systematic schemes, executed during years of methodically planned criminal activity by a mother against her own daughter, exploiting presumed family trust as an easily exploited psychological vulnerability without immediate legal consequences while the only witness remained alive. We agreed Patricia would immediately come to my apartment to examine the bank statements and Dad's handwritten letter before we made joint decisions about how to proceed in the face of that devastating family situation that required careful coordination between both of us to maximize chances of recovering illegally diverted amounts while minimizing risks of Vera implementing defensive strategies based on fabricated narratives about supposedly granted verbal authorizations or falsely alleged conscious participation through deliberate distortions about casual conversations never adequately documented that could be maliciously reinterpreted to transform victims into voluntary accomplices according to distorted versions presented defensively by a perpetrator facing potentially serious legal consequences. During the 37 minutes I waited for Patricia's arrival, I remained sitting on the living room sofa holding the blue folder containing bank statements and Dad's letter, while trying to mentally prepare myself for the intense emotional reaction my sister would inevitably experience when personally examining documentary evidence about systematic misappropriations perpetrated by Vera during years of deliberate criminal activity, executed parallel to maintenance of elaborate public facades, as a devoted mother genuinely concerned about her daughter's well-being when underlying reality revealed calculated willingness to financially harm her own descendants whenever lucrative opportunities arose that were exploitable without immediate detection due to naively presumed family trust. When the doorbell finally rang, announcing Patricia's arrival, my heart involuntarily accelerated, anticipating the imminent emotional confrontation, where we would both collectively process the magnitude of maternal betrayal revealed through that financial documentation meticulously preserved by Dad, as final evidence of transgressions he discovered belatedly, without getting enough time to correct the situation before dying unexpectedly. Eliminating the only witness capable of corroborating the complete extent of systematic diversions, and especially the only parental authority Vera apparently respected sufficiently to hesitate continuing misappropriations, if he remained alive supervising management of the inheritance specifically designated to guarantee his daughter's comfortable futures, regardless of unpredictable circumstances. Patricia entered the apartment visibly tense with a facial expression combining growing apprehension about imminent discoveries and especially understandable reluctance to confirm such devastating accusations against our own mother, secretly preferring to find reasonable alternative explanations that would preserve some vestige of the idealized image we maintained about Vera as a fundamentally decent person who occasionally made errors in judgment, but essentially loved us genuinely, instead of a consciously malicious criminal willing to systematically harm her own daughters through misappropriations, rationalized through distorted narratives about deserving financial compensation for marital sacrifices not adequately recognized during a marriage characterized outwardly by apparent stability. I silently handed the blue folder to Patricia, who sat on the sofa beside me, and began meticulously examining bank statements with progressively trembling fingers, while visually processing the systematic pattern of transfers consistently made on the 15th day of each month during 36 consecutive months, always in approximately the same amount, varying only slightly between $5,000 and $8,000, suggesting careful planning instead of momentary impulses, and especially revealing impressive discipline in executing a fraudulent scheme that required maintaining detailed records about transfer schedules to avoid detection through excessively voluminous movements that could alert automated bank monitoring systems about potentially suspicious activities. I observed in respectful silence while Patricia read Dad's handwritten letter, with tears beginning to progressively stream down her cheeks as she advanced through emotionally charged words documenting his anguish about discovering the misappropriations, and especially the impossible moral dilemma about how to protect my inheritance without publicly destroying the family through devastating legal scandals that would inevitably cause substantial suffering for both innocent daughters, undeserving of being dragged through sordid judicial conflicts about financial crimes perpetrated by their own mother, exploiting family trust as an easily manipulable psychological vulnerability to execute systematic diversions during years of methodically planned criminal activity maintained hidden through elaborate facades of domestic normalcy. When Patricia finally finished reading Dad's letter, she remained sitting motionless, holding the document with trembling hands, while tears continued silently streaming, revealing profound emotional processing of the devastating implications about the magnitude of maternal betrayal and especially about the simultaneous loss of paternal protection that Dad's premature death represented, leaving us vulnerable to continuation of misappropriations during 6 subsequent months when Vera probably intensified financial diversions, trusting that absence of supervision would facilitate expanded criminal activities without significant detection risks until it was too late to recover substantial amounts already spent or transferred to secret offshore accounts inaccessible through conventional legal processes. Carol, this letter from Dad is absolutely devastating, not only for what it reveals about our mother's crimes, but especially because it documents his suffering during the last weeks of his life processing alone, the discovery about misappropriations, without being able to share his anguish with us, because he was desperately trying to protect us from devastating family conflicts he feared would inevitably result if he decided to publicly confront Vera's transgressions, instead of resolving the issue discreetly through private negotiations that his sudden death permanently interrupted. Patricia articulated with a voice choked by conflicting emotions about multiple layers of betrayal and loss simultaneously revealed through that financial documentation meticulously preserved as final evidence. Patricia's observation about Dad's solitary suffering during his last week's processing discovery of misappropriations without sharing his anguish with us added a particularly torturous dimension to that already devastating situation, because it revealed how he had sacrificed his own emotional well, being trying to protect us from knowledge about maternal crimes that would inevitably completely destroy any remaining vestige of family trust and especially transform the maternal relationship from a private dynamic based on blood ties into a public legal confrontation, characterized by formal criminal accusations processed through a judicial system that would inevitably cause unwanted publicity about intimate aspects of our family history, preferable to keep confidential. During the following hour, Patricia and I exhaustively discussed different available courses of action, carefully weighing advantages and disadvantages of each alternative, from direct private confrontation with Vera to formal criminal complaint to police authorities, passing through the intermediate option of hiring a specialized lawyer to resolve the issue through civil action seeking restitution of diverted amounts without necessarily involving a public criminal process that would transform family conflict into a legal case subject to detailed judicial scrutiny, and possibly sensationalist media attention about family fraud involving substantial amounts misappropriated during years of systematic activity, deliberately executed by a mother against daughter, exploiting presumed trust as an easily manipulable vulnerability. Patricia revealed disturbing information she had secretly kept for months, thinking it was just exaggerated concern, but that now assumed completely sinister meaning considering the discovery of misappropriations documented in the bank statements. Approximately 1 year before Dad's death, she had noticed Vera made strange comments during a casual phone conversation about how I supposedly didn't adequately appreciate financial sacrifices our parents had made during decades guaranteeing expensive university educations, and especially about how a successful career as an architect made me a privileged beneficiary, not needing inheritance as substantial as other people, less fortunate professionally, might deserve according to her distorted judgment. Patricia's revelation about Vera's strange comments approximately 1 year before Dad's death suggested the misappropriations probably began being rationalized through gradual construction of distorted narratives, transforming me from a daughter deserving of carefully accumulated inheritance into a supposedly privileged beneficiary not needing additional financial resources due to a stable career, allowing Vera to psychologically justify to herself systematic diversions as fair redistribution of resources instead of criminal thefts against her own daughter, trusting naively in presumed maternal integrity as an unquestionable foundation of family relationships based on supposedly unbreakable blood ties, regardless of opportunistic financial temptations. We jointly decided the most appropriate course of action would be to immediately consult a lawyer specializing in family law and financial crimes before confronting Vera or taking any precipitous measure that could compromise potential future legal processes. Considering the sophistication demonstrated by her in constructing preemptive defensive narratives during Dad's funeral, and especially considering the possibility she was already preparing legal counterattacks, anticipating eventual discovery of misappropriations meticulously documented through bank statements preserved as evidence by Dad during the last weeks before dying unexpectedly, eliminating the only witness capable of corroborating the complete extent of systematic diversions perpetrated during 36 consecutive months. Patricia suggested contacting Dr. Mendez, a respected family lawyer who had assisted Dad for years with legal matters related to the family business, and who possessed an exceptional reputation for professional discretion in cases involving delicate family conflicts requiring resolution through private negotiations instead of public litigation whenever possible. Preserving family relationships while protecting legitimate interests of clients victimized by misappropriations or other financial transgressions, perpetrated by close relatives exploiting family trust as an easily manipulable psychological vulnerability to execute fraudulent schemes without immediate legal consequences, due to victims' understandable reluctance to transform private conflicts into public criminal cases. We managed to schedule an emergency consultation with Dr. Mendez for the following Monday, briefly explaining by phone the urgent nature of the situation involving discovery of substantial misappropriations systematically perpetrated during 3 years by a family member against inheritance, specifically designated through formal will, registered at the notary's office, and especially the critical need for immediate legal guidance about how to protect legitimate financial interests, while minimizing risks of the perpetrator implementing defensive strategies based on fabricated narratives about supposedly granted verbal authorizations or falsely alleged conscious participation through deliberate distortions about maliciously reinterpreted casual conversations. During the weekend that preceded the consultation with Dr. Mendez, I remained in a state of growing anxiety, constantly oscillating between anger about misappropriations deliberately perpetrated by Vera during years of systematic criminal activity, and profound sadness about irreversible loss of any remaining vestige of maternal relationship based on genuine trust. Permanently transformed into an adversarial dynamic characterized by formal legal accusations, and especially by the need to defensively protect myself against potential counterattacks through fabricated narratives she would probably construct trying to transform herself from perpetrator into victim, according to a classic pattern of criminal behavior where transgressors progressively test different defensive justifications. Patricia called Sunday night to inform me she had discovered something additionally disturbing while carefully reviewing her own finances. Suspicious transfers totaling approximately $80,000 had been made from the inheritance account designated for her during the same period of 36 months when Vera diverted $220,000 from my inheritance. Confirming Dad's warning in the handwritten letter about protecting Patricia against possible similar financial manipulations, and especially revealing that Vera's crimes were even more extensive than initially discovered, encompassing systematic misappropriations against both daughters simultaneously executed through a coordinated fraudulent scheme that required maintaining detailed records about multiple bank accounts manipulated in parallel. Patricia's discovery about additional suspicious transfers from her own inheritance transformed the situation from individual misappropriation against me into a much broader criminal scheme, victimizing both daughters simultaneously during the same period of 36 months. Revealing Vera systematically executed coordinated family fraud, diverting an approximate combined total of $300,000 from our inheritances through regular monthly transfers strategically distributed to minimize probability of detection through excessively voluminous movements that could alert automated bank monitoring systems about potentially suspicious activities, requiring additional investigations by employees specializing in financial fraud prevention. On Monday morning, Patricia and I appeared together at Dr. Mendez's office located in an elegant commercial building in the financial district. Carrying the blue folder containing incriminating bank statements and Dad's handwritten letter, plus additional documentation Patricia had compiled about suspicious transfers from her own inheritance, discovered during careful financial review, conducted during the weekend after our initial conversation about misappropriations systematically perpetrated by Vera during 3 years of methodically planned criminal activity, executed parallel to maintenance of elaborate public facades, as a devoted mother genuinely concerned about her daughter's well-being. Dr. Mendez was a 57-year-old man with gray hair impeccably combed back, and attentive blue eyes demonstrating decades of professional experience dealing with complex family cases involving financial fraud among close relatives, requiring delicate balance between protecting legitimate interests of victimized clients and minimizing collateral damage to family relationships whenever possible through private negotiations instead of devastating public litigation that would inevitably cause unwanted publicity about intimate aspects of family histories, preferable to keep confidential away from detailed judicial scrutiny and sensationalist media attention. During the following 2 hours, we exhaustively related the entire sequence of events from my accidental discovery of bank statements in Dad's preserved office to Patricia's subsequent revelation about additional suspicious transfers from her own inheritance, confirming Vera's crimes were much more extensive than initially discovered. Encompassing systematic misappropriations against both daughters simultaneously executed through a coordinated fraudulent scheme, totaling approximately $300,000 diverted during 36 consecutive months, always on the 15th day of each month, revealing impressive discipline and meticulous planning incompatible with momentary impulses or isolated errors in judgment. Dr. Mendez meticulously examined the bank statements and Dad's handwritten letter, making detailed notes while occasionally interrupting our narrative to ask specific technical questions about the chronology of events and especially about any communication we had had with Vera since discovering the misappropriations, it being critical according to him that we not confront the perpetrator prematurely, before establishing a comprehensive legal strategy protecting our interests against potential counterattacks based on fabricated narratives about supposedly granted verbal authorizations or falsely alleged conscious participation through deliberate distortions of casual conversations, maliciously reinterpreted by the defense trying to transform victims into voluntary accomplices. Dr. Mendez's analysis of the presented documentation was simultaneously comforting and concerning. Comforting because he confirmed the evidence constituted an extremely solid basis for a successful legal process seeking full restitution of illegally diverted amounts, plus additional compensation for moral damages caused through betrayal of family trust. But concerning because he warned that cases involving family fraud frequently evolved into prolonged and emotionally devastating legal confrontations, where perpetrators implemented aggressive defensive strategies including fabricated accusations trying to discredit victims through distorted allegations about supposed conscious participation in collaboratively planned fraudulent schemes. Dr. Mendez recommended a 3-stage course of action beginning with immediate registration of a detailed police report at a specialized precinct, officially establishing our status as victims of family fraud instead of voluntary participants, followed by formal extrajudicial notification sent to Vera through a lawyer, demanding full restitution of diverted amounts within a specific deadline before we initiated formal judicial processes. And finally, if she refused to cooperate voluntarily, we would proceed with comprehensive civil action, seeking not only recovery of the $300,000 misappropriated, but also substantial compensation for moral damages caused through years of psychological manipulation and systematic betrayal of family trust. The prospect of confronting Vera through formal extrajudicial notification was terrifying, considering it would definitively transform private family conflict into formally documented legal dispute, officially establishing irreconcilable adversarial positions between mother and daughters characterized by explicit criminal accusations, instead of remote possibility of resolving the issue through private conversations, preserving some vestige of family relationship. Although this alternative seemed increasingly unrealistic, considering the magnitude of misappropriations, and especially the sophistication demonstrated by Vera, in constructing preemptive defensive narratives, anticipating future discoveries about financial crimes systematically perpetrated during 3 entire years. Following Dr. Mendez's guidance, Patricia and I appeared together at the precinct, specializing in financial crimes that same Monday afternoon, to register a detailed police report relating misappropriations totaling $300,000 systematically diverted from our inheritances during 36 consecutive months by our own mother, exploiting family trust as a psychological vulnerability to execute a coordinated fraudulent scheme that continued intensifying during 6 months after Dad's death. Eliminating the only witness capable of corroborating the complete extent of financial diversions, and especially the only parental authority Vera apparently respected sufficiently to potentially cease criminal activities if he remained alive, supervising adequate management of designated inheritances. The detective responsible for registering the police report was an experienced man who demonstrated compassionate professionalism when processing our statements, obviously understanding the extreme emotional sensitivity involved in formally denouncing crimes perpetrated by one's own mother against daughters, trusting naively in presumed maternal integrity as an unquestionable foundation of family relationships. But he also firmly warned that family fraud cases frequently involved fabricated accusations by perpetrators trying to discredit victims through distorted allegations about conscious participation in collaborative schemes. It being absolutely critical that we maintain meticulous documentation about all future communication with Vera to defensively protect ourselves against potential manipulations of narratives presented subsequently. Approximately 1 week after we registered the police report, Dr. Mendez sent a formal extrajudicial notification to Vera through registered letter with return receipt, demanding full restitution of $300,000 illegally diverted from our inheritances, plus accumulated interest calculated from the date of each fraudulent transfer totaling approximately $400,000 considering the elapsed period. Granting a deadline of 15 business days for formal response before we initiated comprehensive judicial process, seeking not only recovery of misappropriated amounts, but also substantial compensation for moral damages caused through years of psychological manipulation and systematic betrayal of family trust, deliberately executed during a period when we should have been collectively processing grief over Dad's loss, instead of discovering secretly perpetrated financial crimes. Vera's reaction to the extrajudicial notification was exactly as manipulative and defensive as Dr. Mendez had predicted, based on professional experience with similar family fraud cases. She immediately hired her own lawyer, who responded through formal letter, alleging bank transfers had been explicitly authorized by Dad before his death to cover emergency expenses related to residential renovations, and especially that both Patricia and I had been verbally informed about temporary use of resources during casual conversations, never adequately documented according to a completely fabricated version, frontally contradicting Dad's handwritten letter, specifically documenting confrontation about misappropriations, and Vera's cold admission about having taken money because she believed she deserved additional compensation. Vera's fabricated response through her lawyer confirmed Dr. Mendez's predictions about defensive strategies, based on distorted narratives trying to transform criminal misappropriations into legitimately authorized transactions, and especially trying to falsely implicate Patricia and me as having conscious knowledge about transfers, characterizing us as voluntary participants instead of victims, discovering crimes only recently through accidental finding of bank statements preserved by Dad as evidence of transgressions. He discovered belatedly without getting enough time to correct the situation before dying unexpectedly, eliminating the only witness capable of definitively refuting fabricated allegations, presented defensively by a perpetrator facing serious legal consequences. Following Dr. Mendez's guidance, we immediately proceeded with comprehensive judicial action against Vera, seeking full restitution of $400,000, including accumulated interest plus additional compensation of $200,000 for moral damages caused through years of psychological manipulation and systematic betrayal of family trust, totaling a demand of $600,000 to be paid compulsorily through judicial decision if Vera continued refusing to voluntarily restitute amounts misappropriated during 36 months of methodically planned criminal activity executed parallel to maintenance of elaborate public facades as a devoted mother, when underlying reality revealed calculated willingness to financially harm her own daughters, exploiting presumed trust as an easily manipulable vulnerability. The following 18 months were an emotionally exhausting period of judicial processes, characterized by frequent hearings where lawyers presented technical arguments about appropriate legal interpretations of documentary evidence, including irrefutable bank statements, and especially Dad's devastating handwritten letter that constituted posthumous testimony completely refuting fabricated narratives by Vera about supposed verbal authorizations granted for temporary transfers that would be subsequently restituted according to a defensive version, frontally contradicting her admission during confrontation with Dad about having taken money because she believed she deserved additional compensation for marital sacrifices not adequately recognized during a 42-year marriage. During the judicial process, Vera tried to implement an additional victimization strategy through fabricated allegations about experiencing cognitive deterioration related to aging that compromised judgment during the period when transfers were made, requesting psychiatric evaluation that supposedly would demonstrate diminished capacity to fully understand moral or legal implications of her actions. But this defensive tactic was completely refuted through witness testimonies, including Roberto, paternal uncle and retired accountant who confirmed having professionally interacted with Vera during the same period, attesting she demonstrated completely intact cognitive capacities when discussing complex financial issues related to management of personal investments, revealing sophistication incompatible with allegations of mental deterioration. Roberto's testimony was particularly devastating for Vera's defense because he revealed additionally disturbing information we didn't previously know. Approximately 2 years before Dad's death, Vera had confidentially consulted him about strategies to minimize inheritance taxes through early distribution of resources through multiple bank accounts controlled by different family members. Roberto had naively provided technical guidance, presuming she was legitimately planning future transfers authorized by Dad. But retrospectively, That consultation clearly revealed itself as preparatory research for the fraudulent scheme she was beginning to systematically plan, demonstrating substantial premeditation, incompatible with momentary impulses, or defensively alleged cognitive deterioration. After 18 months of prolonged litigation, the judge responsible for the case issued a final decision extremely favorable to our demands, determining Vera must fully restitute $400,000, including accumulated interest plus compensation of $150,000 for moral damages, totaling $550,000 to be paid compulsorily through judicial execution of assets, if she didn't comply voluntarily within the stipulated deadline. A decision fundamentally based on Dad's irrefutable handwritten letter, documenting confrontation about misappropriations and especially on the systematic pattern of transfers consistently made during 36 months, unequivocally demonstrating premeditation and meticulous planning incompatible with defensive allegations about verbal authorizations or cognitive deterioration, compromising judgment during the relevant period. The judicial victory was simultaneously comforting by officially validating our position as victims of family fraud, instead of voluntary participants according to defensively fabricated narratives, but also profoundly melancholic because it definitively confirmed the irreversible destruction of any remaining vestige of maternal relationship based on genuine trust, permanently transformed into an adversarial dynamic, characterized by formal judicial decision determining our own mother must compulsorily pay substantial compensation for financial crimes, systematically perpetrated against daughters, during years of methodically planned fraudulent activity, executed parallel to maintenance of elaborate facades of maternal devotion, when underlying reality revealed calculated willingness to harm descendants exploiting family trust. Vera reluctantly complied with the judicial determination through bank transfer of the $550,000 within the stipulated deadline, avoiding compulsory execution of assets that would inevitably cause additional unwanted publicity about an already sensitive case. But she never admitted culpability or expressed genuine remorse about systematically perpetrated misappropriations, maintaining until the end a defensive posture of victimization, alleging she had been unjustly persecuted by ungrateful daughters, not adequately appreciating marital sacrifices made during decades enduring emotional neglect from Dad, according to a distorted narrative she apparently internalized so profoundly. She managed to genuinely convince herself of the truth of her own psychological fabrications. 3 years have passed since that devastating morning when I discovered incriminating bank statements in Dad's preserved office. And during this period, the emotional processing of maternal betrayal, and especially prolonged judicial litigation, were transformative experiences that fundamentally modified my understanding about complexities of family relationships, and especially about how apparently normal people manage to rationalize profoundly unethical behaviors through construction of distorted narratives that transform victims into villains and perpetrators into martyrs, deserving compensation for supposedly heroic sacrifices. Patricia and I gradually rebuilt our sisterly relationship, strengthened by shared experience of victimization, and especially by the collaborative process of seeking legal justice. As for Vera, we currently maintain respectful distance without any regular communication beyond minimal obligatory interactions during inevitable family occasions like nephews' birthdays, where we preserve appearances of superficial civility without ever rebuilding genuine trust irreversibly, destroyed through years of systematic misappropriations, and especially through her persistent refusal to assume responsibility or express authentic remorse about financial crimes deliberately perpetrated against her own daughters, exploiting presumed maternal trust as an easily manipulable psychological vulnerability to execute a coordinated fraudulent scheme during 36 months of methodically planned criminal activity. The most important lesson I learned through that devastating experience is that family trust should not be automatically presumed based merely on blood ties, but rather continuously built through consistent behaviors demonstrating genuine integrity. And especially that appropriate vigilance over shared financial matters constitutes prudent responsibility, instead of offensive mistrust, because even biologically close people can succumb to temptations when opportunities arise that are exploitable without immediate legal consequences. Presuming naivety of potential victims blindly trusting in family relationships, supposedly founded on unconditional love, when underlying reality may reveal much more complex and disturbing dynamics. Did you enjoy Carolina's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.